Hello everyone, my name is Rose Thorne and today I am doing a book review on a book about Jim Morrison, and it's called Strange Days, My Life with and Without Jim Morrison by Patricia Kennealy. So I watched the movie The Doors, and one of the characters of that movie is an actress who plays the part of Patricia Kennealy. And I watched the movie, and because of a portrayal of the actress, I was very intrigued by Patricia Kennealy, who she was and where she'd come from and her education and such. And so I did some digging, and I found that Patricia Kennealy had written a book about her time with Jim Morrison. So I bought it and I read it, and I knew before reading the book that Jim Morrison, his main relationship that everybody knows him for, was having a relationship with Pam Morrison, Pamela Corrison Morrison. That was his cosmic mate. That was his girl. Everybody knows about him being with her. Patricia Kennealy was, because of that, the shadow girlfriend, the shadow lover, the shadow wife. She was never in the spotlight with Jim. He never talked about her. He never publicly put out that he was in a relationship with her. But because it was so long ago, nobody can verify anything, but still, Pamela Corrison Morrison was the main girlfriend and the common-law wife, and Patricia Kennealy was the shadow girlfriend or shadow wife, if you will. Knowing that there was all this love triangle messiness going on, I didn't want to read the book with prejudice. I wanted to read it from the point of view of, I'm just going to take it in as it is and see what Patricia says. And I did. And it's a very well-written book, giving accounts of different things about how she came to know of Jim and them talking and spending time together and having, I guess, an affair or a relationship, if you will, and then her getting pregnant and having an abortion, and then him dying and how she felt about that. It's a really good account. You can tell that she's well written, well spoken. The book is definitely good on that. But despite the fact that I read the book without prejudice, I wanted to read it from a neutral point of view and just take it in as a woman talking about another person. I read the book, and all through the book, there's this underlying sadness and bitterness and resentment that Patricia has against Pamela Corrison Morrison. Because Pamela Corrison Morrison was Jim Morrison's muse. She was his cosmic soulmate. No matter who Jim was sleeping with, he always went back to her. And there are stories that Pamela, she wasn't the best person, that perhaps she allegedly did drugs and slept around and she was a junkie. But putting that aside, that was the person that Jim wanted to be with, that he was with for many, many years. And the book that I just read, this one, there's a sense of underlying large resentment that Patricia has for Pamela Corrison Morrison, because Patricia wanted to be in a relationship with Jim publicly, and Pamela pretty much stood in her way. I'm sure that Patricia, being a well-educated, well-spoken, stable, strong person, it drove her nuts that the man she was in love with a woman who was completely bad for him, and there was nothing she could do about it. But she did have a relationship with Jim, and she details that in the book. She details that very well, and she makes a lot of claims about stuff. But I'm sorry, Patricia, if you see this video, but I picked up on so much resentment and bitterness that you have for Pamela. just because she was in the picture with Jim and you weren't. And writer to writer, when you wrote this book, you should have left that bitterness out of the book, because you had to know by putting the bitterness and the anger in the book that it would derail all the things you wanted to do with the book. You wanted to write a book that told the truth about your relationship with Jim, that set the facts straight, but the anger and the bitterness just comes shining through. And that is exactly what people were expecting you to do. They were expecting you to show that anger and that resentment for Pamela, and you didn't let them down in the book, and it kind of takes away from the purpose of the book. Like, there are parts in here that it's just, there's so much jealousy and anger and bitterness that it is unbelievable. Like, there's one part in here where Patricia did like a self-interview, like somebody's interviewing her and asking questions. And there's one part with a question. Here's one of the questions. Thoughts on Pamela Susan Morrison? What about these new depictions of her as having been tough and forceful? That she really pussy whipped Jim and called all the shots in the relationship? And her reply is, the red-headed remora? The only shots she ever called were the ones in her arms. As for the new thinking on Pam, well, consider the sources. You generally find that sort of swill oozing out of the word processors of people who needed to suck up to her parents for permission to use poetry quotations and such in books or, say, a movie. That was her throwing shade at the Doors movie. She didn't like it at all. As for the pussy whipping, by Pam's own word to me, by the time I came along, she and Jim weren't even fucking anymore. For my part, I can speak only of the woman I met, the woman Jim occasionally spoke of, the woman some of her friends told me of. I have tried not to weight the stats. It goes further. So the question is, so? Her reply, the Pam I knew was a user in all senses of the word. By no means charmless, extremely pretty, she had the incredible strength of the weak, and the grasping and the parasitical of those who feed on anyone rather than take responsibility for feeding, and not just in the elementary sense, themselves. As far as I know, though, I'd gladly be told otherwise, Pam never had a real job in her entire life. Lazy, sense of entitlement. She couldn't even manage to run the boutique Jim bought for her, too. No attention span, irresponsible, and gunned a truck through the shop window to hasten its demise. So she just goes on to trash talk Pamela Morrison in this book. And as I said earlier, Patricia, I understand you wanted to write a book to tell people about your relationship to Jim, and you wanted to keep the facts straight. I understand that, but all of that bitterness for Pamela about who she was and how she lived her life and her relationship to Jim, you really should have left that out, because people were expecting you to do that, and you did not let them down. And that bitterness, that resentment comes right through, especially with this interview. Did you really need to post that interview part about Pamela? No, you could have just stayed mum about that and stayed on the course with your book, but you didn't do it. And you come off as a very bitter, angry woman. That Jim was with Pamela and not with you. That Jim did not choose to be with you. That he wasn't with you publicly. That the most you got was a shadow relationship with Jim. You were never in the spotlight with him. You never stood by his side publicly. You were in the shadows, while Pamela, someone that you feel was unworthy, she was with him publicly and would always be with him publicly. And I think there's a lot of boiling over anger because of that. And that's what I got out of this book. There's a lot of things here in this book that can't be verified. It's just a first-person account. But there's a lot of things said in a factual way, but there's also things said from an emotional point of view that take away from the book and just kind of diminish and tarnish the purpose of it, which was to straighten the facts out. If you are someone that you are interested in Jim Morrison, learning about him, do I recommend reading this book? I think it's an interesting read, but I think if you're someone that you're interested in this book, you should read it with a grain of salt. And you should understand that the woman writing the book, that she did have a relationship with him, and the fact that he had someone else in the picture that he would not let go of was kind of a thorn in her heart that never got removed. And in her writing, it does show every now and again, and you'll pick that up when you write it. I know that Patricia Kennealy, if you search her out on YouTube, she calls herself the Lizard Queen. Patricia, no offense to you, Mama, even if you did have a Wiccan ceremony with Jim Morrison, you are not, nor will you ever be, the Lizard Queen. And I'll tell you why. Because Jim only had one true soulmate, and that was Pamela Morrison Morrison. She was his common-law wife. She was the one that when he wrote 2 books of poetry, he dedicated the books of poetry to her. She was his main relationship. If anybody's going to be the Lizard Queen, it would be her. Because, right or wrong, she was his partner. If you had a relationship to him, that's a very special thing, but you shouldn't go around calling yourself the Lizard Queen, because that's not correct. But otherwise, those of you that are wanting to find stuff on Jim Morrison, do I recommend buying this? Sure. It makes an interesting read. As I said, take it with a grain of salt. It was written by a woman who was involved with Jim, but not close enough that she wanted, just off to the side. So that's my review of this book. Please take care and have a good one.